Afternoon, everybody, wherever you are. We're going to talk for about an hour about the international financial system in times of Corona. And we've invited some excellent guests. In order of appearance, we'll talk to Arnoud Boot. He is Professor of Corporate Finance and Financial Markets at the University of Amsterdam. We'll talk to Connie Dorrestein. She's one of the top 50 women in financial tech and used to travel the whole world for consulting work for banks. We'll talk to Chris Skinner, author, one of the most looked after speakers when it comes to economic issues. And finally, Gijs Boudewijn. He is with the Dutch Payment Association, and he will talk about the payment system in this turbulent times of Corona. A lot of business in trouble, but apparently his business is booming and flourishing. So
yeah, he's the one who has the positive insight that everything keeps on working. Okay, yeah. So hey, welcome Arnoud, Chris, and Connie.
Hi, Chris.
Good day.
Hey there.
Chris there.
Vincent.
Yeah. Okay, so wonderful to have you here. I mean, this started because Sharon and I were going like, what is happening with the financial system with the strain that the coronavirus is basically giving us? So, and we have three unique perspectives, from the top, the scientific one. Connie is going in the organization, and Chris is traveling around the world, basically inspiring people to be more innovative. So we're going to talk about different aspects of it. Let's start with Arnoud. From the top down, Arnoud, can you tell us, the strain on the financial system must be enormous. The amount of loans, the amount of reduction of the gross national product. What strain is on the financial system, and how do you think it will hold up?
Vincent, those are big questions.
Big questions.
They are very big questions because we are in a somewhat unusual period. We haven't had a period, at least not in our lives, where we put in basically a full stop to a sizable part of economic activity. And so we have a bottom-up problem in a sense. We have sizable parts of the corporate sector that basically are in trouble, at least not earning money. And what does that mean for banks? It means that non-performing loans are going up very quickly. So banks automatically feel the strain of a corporate sector that does not function. And then on top of it, we have countries sovereign countries that some are stronger than others. And we see strain on, for example, Italy, where any suggestion that the ECB, the European Central Bank, would not be fully ready to support Italy will automatically lead to higher interest rates on Italian debt. So there's strain coming from the business side on banks. There's strain coming on countries. Countries are very important for local banks. So, for example, Italian banks are heavily indebted to the Italian sovereign. And these interrelationships create a very unpredictable environment.
Before we continue with you, Arnoud, also the same question for you, Connie. What is your general assessment of the situation we're in right now when it comes to the international financial system? What's your approach? What's your opinion?
Well, I think that two things really struck me more than anything, and it is that we hung on to these ideas that, as banks we needed digital was only a channel, and we needed the bank offices, and and I've been prophetising about this forever, that we don't need them. People said they will not change their payment behavior. Germans will use cash. Well, you see the cash drop in 80% in one day. They don't like online banking in Germany. 2.5 million people applied for an online banking account in one day at Deutsche Bank. 1 in 14,000 people in Holland have access to a bank office. Arnoud was just speaking about Italy. That's 1 in 1,750. So what is very, very clear is that although the incumbent banks need to modernize, and they'll probably be with us, some of them for a long time, digital is not a channel, it is the business model. And if they want to get their costs down, that is the only way to go. And I think we've now all seen it is possible.
So then Corona is the big accelerator here.
It is, I think, in all fairness, it is a big accelerator. I think it will drag the banks who get it 10 years forward.
Wow.
Yeah.
If we talk about somebody who's been trying to teach the banks how to be digital and is traveling around the world, and who is now stuck in a little office in in his home, Chris, how do you like the lockdown, and what has been the influence on your business, and what do you think of the acceleration of innovation?
You're in Warsaw, right?
Yeah, I'm just outside Warsaw, luckily in a place with a nice big garden. Otherwise, I'd be going stir crazy. And
Garden and Wi-Fi. What else do you need, right?
well, coincidentally, just before the lockdown occurred, we upgraded the Wi-Fi system to 5G. So it's been amazingly good. And we have 2 Wi-Fis just in case, because if Wi-Fi went down, we'd be lost. But what's interesting for me is I'm dealing from Poland with UK banks. Because my main banking business and personal is with banks based in Britain. And in both cases, they've been a disaster. I can't get hold of them. We have to wait hours on the telephone to get through to a human being. And in one particular instance, not only did they have a Indian-based call center that disappeared with 4 hours notice, but they had a online issue, so I couldn't actually access the online services. They don't have an app because they're that backward. And it was just terrible. For 6 weeks, I couldn't get any access to the bank. And in this current situation, that's not a good situation to be in. So I think, concurring with Arno and Connie, we're going to see a speed towards digital transformation post-pandemic coming through very quickly with these analog organizations that now realize exactly how backward they are, because they didn't have any backup for their physical structures. They didn't have a digital reach. And the companies that have really excelled in this crisis are the ones that do online to offline well, like Amazon. If I didn't have Amazon during this crisis, again, I'd have been sort of stranded, because I'm getting stuff coming from Britain to Poland and entertaining my kids because I can get it delivered to the door.
Yeah. That's true. Hey, let's
you are now. I mean, journalists mostly have a pretty negative outlook on life. So let me ask you a negative question, maybe with a positive answer. Arnold, why didn't the system collapse? All the conditions for a total financial collapse, way worse than 2008, are there, and the system still holds up. Can you explain why?
Yes, Charles, the answer is very simple. The public authorities, central banks, and governments have been lying fully below the financial system already for years. Since the financial crisis, it has become totally clear that financial authorities, central banks, governments are supporting the financial system at all costs. And so that's basically that safety net, which is the taxpayer, which is all of us, is core to the financial system. And it is even more so today, but also what Connie and Chris were describing, this digital transformation. Think about what it means for many financial institutions in the world, which have technology that date back from the Apollo era, the 60s. So they are really stuck, basically. And the only reason why it doesn't create massive issues is massive government and central bank support.
But you just said, governments support the economy at all costs. That cannot literally be true at all costs. At some point, there's an end to the billions and billions of dollars Donald Trump or the ECB or any government entity is pumping into the system. What do you mean by at all costs?
In the case of central Chris, go ahead.
Just want to add to that question, Arno, which is, what's your position and view on countries that actually have weak economies? Because obviously African nations have locked down, South American nations have locked down. What's the impact there as well?
Yeah, that's Chris. That's really the dreadful thing of this crisis. We, being here in Europe, we talk about controversies between Netherlands and Italy, basically in the developed economy. If you see the consequences that a crisis, basically any crisis, has for emerging countries, for less developed countries, that basically is always dreadful. There have been very few cases, hopefully you have a more optimistic view on it. There are very few cases where crises that we have created because this is not created by emerging countries. This is created by the West. The financial crisis and all the corona discussion we have today is here in the West. The consequences typically for the less developed world are much more dreadful than they are for us. There are no massive support systems. There are no central banks with reputation. There is no massive wealth. It's the opposite. Every time there is a major problem in the world, the money disappears from the less developed economies and rushes towards the more developed economies. So it's really like a bank run on those countries.
That's the worst case scenario you're painting here.
For the third world, we have to, and that's also why the IMF and the World Bank, I think they both have been very adamant. They have been less focused on Europe. They have been focused on what are the implications for emerging and less developed economies in this crisis. And from every perspective, think about a health perspective. What type of health system do they have?
That's pretty worrisome, Connie, for the big banks, right? I mean, because they have to support the system. It's supported by governments, but eventually it comes down to the banks as well. So talk a little bit about a scenario Arnold was just giving us when it comes to less developed countries.
Sorry. I have a personal interest in less developed countries because I work with the Global Give Back Circle, and we support kids that come out of school, and we make sure that they get a buddy, they get education, etc., etc. So I have my best view on all of this is Kenya. And funny enough, of course, they leapfrogged this whole problem of, backward technology. And so we see that for us getting money to our girls, and I'm literally talking about girls who've gone home from Nairobi to their villages with literally, they go to the nearest Wi-Fi shop to do a number of things. It's actually, we often get money to them faster than we do in Europe, simply because we use fintech systems, we don't use the banks. So that is not the real big issue. That is a totally different issue from what Arnoud's talking about, which is sort of the big stability thing. But what I talk about when I speak with my mentees on Friday, they talk about, well, if my family gets this, there are no ICs in Africa. There is no, the whole system is just not there. And on the other hand, and this is terrible, is their acceptance of bad events happening in life is much higher. I mean, we've become an utterly spoiled society whereby you're not allowed to get ill, nobody's supposed to die, everybody's supposed to be happy all the time. And it's tragic, but in Africa, I often feel they are stronger, in Kenya, my girls at least, because they know that it's part of life that things happen. And so they really are just worried about how do I sustain my immediate circle, my sister and her kids and my mother. And so they are very much, and they really realize like they do it by getting a better life themselves.
Yeah.
And
how is it in Warsaw, Chris? If you talk about on the eastern side of the bloc, how is life there?
Well, I mean, here, I think the issue is that the government support has not been as demonstrable as in many other countries of Europe. It's kind of behind Italy in terms of the way in which I've seen government roll out support to the citizens and small businesses. Having said that, they locked down very early, and they didn't have so many cases because of that. So the easing of restrictions is just starting to come through. There actually is, if you probably haven't noticed, a big fallout between Poland and the European Union because there's an election taking place here, which meant the government's easing restrictions to have the election when they shouldn't be easing them so soon. But I wanted to throw kind of a few questions on the table just to get your views, in that when you're locked in like this, it starts your brain, asking questions of itself and not knowing the answers, and you become a little bit existential. Because I sat there and I just thought, when you see America announce a $2 trillion stimulus program, where's that $2 trillion coming from? How have they just invented all this money? And the same in most European nations. Where's it all coming from? And we know it's coming from debt. And if you are a AAA nation, then debt is easy to generate. But if you're a Triple C nation, and that's why I asked the question about some of the developing economies, they can't create debt, and in fact debt is something that's been created for them. But then when you start asking these existential questions, you then say, well, actually, what is money? Because it's just a fictional creation of government. And so if we took that away, and that's what's been interesting in the last 2 months to me, if you take away the financial pressure that forces you to work, what do you end up doing? In my case, I end up learning Polish.
Finally, Chris, thank God.
Finally. I can't speak it, I can read it now.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
But I mean, I'm interested in that too, Arnoud. My question is, we're going to have an enormous increase of debt. I mean, are the countries are just starting to borrow? So the 2 trillion in America, but also the trillions and trillions of dollars which we're going to, or euros, we're going to basically create or loan in Europe. Can we create endless amount of money until inflation is going to hit? I mean, everybody thought you cannot create endless amount of money because you're going to have inflation, but it doesn't seem to happen. Can we create in the Western world money for free?
Vincent, and also Chris' question, they're right on the spot. In the end, there are no free lunches. In the end, there are no free lunches. In between, you may think there are free lunches. And unfortunately, and this is the bad thing about economists and about assessing economics, is that the moment where it appears a free lunch to the moment where it no longer is a free lunch, this whole timing business, we have no idea. Yeah. So if you ask today, what is the risk today? The risk today is definitely not inflation. The risk today is deflation. It's the opposite. The risk today is deflation. But we are creating money like crazy. So we are borrowing money, unlimited amounts. And to come back to Charles' question, central banks can basically create money indefinitely, more or less. That's also why the central bank is the ultimate guardian for the euro, because it can prevent any one country in the eurozone from dropping out. The central bank, as long as the central bank, the European Central Bank, is allowed to act. So as long as they can act. Governments are less able to do that because governments, they at least have to acknowledge where the money is coming from. Yeah. They have to acknowledge it. So there are people that today say that let the money that the government would have to borrow, let the ECB just create it. And we call this monetary financing. So literally the central bank would basically give the money to governments, and the governments can spend the money without incurring in debt. So the money comes out of nowhere.
Yeah.
I'm extremely hesitant that we go... Huh?
Sorry, that's not their charter, is it, to create money, the ECB?
Yeah.
Now, let's put it separately for the moment, what they are allowed to do or not allowed to do, because I can tell you one thing. Even this German court, which seems to be the guardian for the prudential behavior of the European Central Bank, at least it's the only authority in Europe that seems to put limits on the ECB, apart from the rules which can be bended. Even if you follow the German court, you see that it has been amending, it has been trying, even in its own way, to find an escape out of literally tying the ECB hands. So I'm not that pessimistic, if you allow me to call it pessimistic, that the German court will prevent the ECB from doing what it is doing. But I have another warning. If the ECB creates money out of nowhere, and it basically means that the ECB becomes a player which is even more on the front page of the newspaper. Yeah. And what role would it get? And let me just give you the example. If Brussels is creating in 2000, a 2,000 billion package. We have to be careful what
2,000 billion. I mean, you can't imagine anymore.
2 trillion. So they're talking about 2 trillion, which is 2,000 billion. Yeah. So let's not confuse the zeros. Once these numbers become so large, we start confusing the zeros. When they create that package, today they still have to ask, where do we get the money? Do we get it from the member states? Do we borrow against the EU budget? So do we borrow? Or, as some economists have been suggesting, can we just throw it to the ECB? I would be extremely hesitant to give the ECB that role today, literally, because they would come up with a package, they would throw it to the ECB, finance it, and the ECB would have to say, nah, the package doesn't look that good to us, it looks too big, it looks too small. So the ECB becomes like a superpower. and becomes like the ultimate parliament on our economic decisions. So what is left of the independence of the ECB? So I think we have to remain accountable to our expenses. I think that's crucial. And it is difficult because how is the ECB, how is the European Union, let's be careful,
European Union,
going to finance the 2 trillion?
So I'm
no, it's much easier to put it out of thin air. And if you look at the big blocks, so you have Europe with the ECB, we have the Fed in America, and we have the Chinese government. At what point are these blocks big enough that they can do this unlimited amount of money creations? I mean, we see also the viewers, they have the same kind of question. There's a lot of them. But we want to know. You say there is no free lunch, but the free lunch has been going on from 2008 till now, and actually before that, everybody who had access to credit could buy assets. These assets, the stocks, the houses, the real estate, everything went up in value. And the people who did not have credit couldn't do that. They just got very low interest. How long can this free lunch for the top people who have money and access to credit, how long can it take? I mean, it's really, you cannot predict it. But can it take another 5 years or 10 years?
Oh, for sure.
When is hyperinflation going to come around the corner?
Oh, let's be clear. We have no idea about timing issues. So there is no reason to say that within 5 years we will end up in a situation of hyperinflation. There's no reason to say that. There's also no reason to say that that's impossible. To give you the example of the US has the benefit of one central bank and one country. So it is a lot easier than ECB. Everything that the ECB does is always interpreted as north against the south or west against the east. In the US, there is one central bank, one country. As long as the dollar is the reserve country in the world, so as long as the dollar is considered the most safe currency and the superior currency in the world that everybody wants to have, and every central bank puts its reserves in the dollar, as long as it has that status, the US can do whatever it wants. till the moment that there is doubt. And that people say, maybe we get a new superpower, like the British lost against the US, the sterling lost against the dollar at some point, till the doubt comes in and people say, maybe we should have a basket of currencies, or we should have the Chinese currency as the reserve currency. We no longer trust the US. But then it is a tipping point. It's not a slow motion. It will be, everything is okay till it is not okay.
But Chris, how close are we to the point where what Arnoud is talking about, and we've been reading about American decline as long as I followed the United States, it's been quite a while. I mean, we've been talking about decline of the US, right? So, and there's again a lot of talk about, the US going down and China coming up, etc. How close are we to the tipping point where the US is no longer, with its strong dollar, the leading economic force in the world? What do you think?
Well, some may say the coronavirus was Chinese made to speed up the tipping point of the superpowers, because basically it will accelerate Chinese dominance on the world post-pandemic. And that's fairly clear already in terms of not only because they have a much more central state structure where the people follow what the government says, meant that they lock down far quicker and open up therefore far quicker. But equally, their coordination of their movement and their economy itself has leapfrogged Europe and America because it's all digital. There's a headline in the FT the other day about when Wuhan closed down and the banks shut for months, no one cared because they don't need banks. They've got digital payment services and digital wallets. Equally, when you go to China, you do find that the speed at which they coordinate activity is incredible. Whereas when you just watch what's going on in America and the fact that they locked down late, they've had the highest number of deaths, they have the highest number of protests against the lockdown because they believe they're a democracy with freedom of speech and freedom of movement. It's been a disaster for the USA. What I see happening, though, and I blogged about it the other day based on a paper I was reading of different scenarios, is a number of extremes. And one is that I think this truly is a test of the European Union and whether it can survive. We've already referenced, the Dutch and the Germans don't like bailing out the Italians and the Spanish. Post-pandemic, how's that going to play out? But equally more than that, I think the number of unemployed in the rich nations that will come out of this, people are saying it's anything from 1 in 3 to half the people who were employed will no longer have work immediately after the pandemic. Does that create civil unrest? It's bound to. It's bound to create issues. And what you may see is Europe and America getting into this disastrous civil unrest breakup of their countries and union, and China taking over. And going to Arna's point, America doesn't have one bank. It's got 50 states, and they argue with the central bank, the Fed, over that structure. And each of the states have their own federal bank that often has its own regulations that blocks things happening that the central government wants to do.
Into a stalemate. Yeah.
Connie, go ahead.
I think they lobby themselves into a stalemate position. I mean, why does America still have checks? Because the check and print business is so huge that people lobby against digital banking. I mean, that is literally what is happening. I mean, I saw an article today. I actually took a screenshot for a future presentation. I'm going to send it to you, Chris. And it says innovation or the coronavirus in US banking will do good to postal banking service. And I'm like, yeah, sure. I mean, let's go. But I think the other thing with China, Chris, and you know that, is that we all focus now on the banking system, but raw materials are another massive indicator. And China either sits on or owns most of the raw materials we need to make our businesses more future-oriented, sustainable, and modern. And that is another grasp that they hold over us. Anything we need to build batteries or whatever is either in Africa and China owns it, or it is in China. So,
well, I think it's interesting to see the if you see below the upper screen, like where Arnoud is and where I am and Charles, we're wondering about where does money come from, where does it flow. Chris and Connie are inside the institutions where that money is basically nicely being audited and accounted and everybody. And we want digital methods. We want to be modern. But the discussion is two ways. One is this overall system keeping, is that going to last? And it can last for 10 years. And Lex Hoogduin always says it can last forever. Nothing happens. But when it accelerates much faster than you ever expected. And that's what Arnoud is saying too. Yeah. And you guys, Chris and Connie, are inside these institutions, trying to them more flexible, more digital, more have more fintech technology that you're not so dependent on the banks. But the big system needs to be in place. Now, I've been a couple of times to. I'm going every year. I'm going to China a couple of times, and I am really. If you look at soft power, this crisis, I think, is going to be really good for China for the soft crisis. I mean, the Americans might, they are trying to basically accuse China of everything. But if you saw how able China was able to handle that crisis, and basically, with 3,000 people dead, I mean, we have now 5,000 people dead in the whole of China, and that everything just went on. That will look for a lot of countries incredible, that they are very powerful and they know how to handle that. I don't know what that means for the economic system, the hardcore system, and for the Chinese currency and for the investments they do around the world. But I think this will, for the most countries, this will be great for China. China will come out stronger out of this perspective. Yeah. And anybody who's been there a couple of times knows that the society looks goddamn impressive in terms of infrastructure, in terms of economic growth, in terms of innovation. Not in terms of human rights, and we're always looking at it. How long can this last? But I think this will be very good for China. Now, on the top side, Arnoud, will this also help to make China stronger in the big financial business?
Vincent, it's always where the economic success is. That's where the power is, and where power is the financial system. So these things are intertwined. And the financial system in history has always been the power center, by implication or by start, and typically by implication. So the economic success of China means success of China in the financial arena. But I would like to take us away from one suggestion, which is very difficult today, given all the US first, nation first type of attitudes. The world is not what economists would call a zero-sum game. It's not the success of one is at the expense of the other. The very simple example. What is the most important for the Netherlands? It's that Germany is doing well. That's not it's our competitor in some sense. Where are we producing things? But it is also where we sell our stuff. So, and that's what the world is. It's not a zero-sum game. You have a benefit if another part of the world does well. And China, the fact that China comes up and that the average Chinese is finally also going to share in the benefits, is going to consume, because that's the next phase, that the average Chinese has a benefit. That could be a benefit to the world, could be a benefit to the US. But what we always have seen in history, and China is the best example, when the Industrial Revolution came up, the Industrial Revolution, so we're talking about 160 years ago, 170 years ago, the Industrial Revolution. England was the power center of the Industrial Revolution. China was the biggest economy. 170 years ago, China biggest economy. China considered the Industrial Revolution a threat, because that was England, and China closed its borders. And the fact that it closed its borders meant the decline of China over the 140 years following that. So closing your borders means that you're going in decline, not the fact that the other guy is doing well.
Yeah. What do you think, Chris?
Brexit.
Yeah.
Chris, go ahead.
No, it's absolutely true.
No, I
But
find
you see, the borders are
about
closing. The borders are closing, and not just US. Look at what the European leaders are saying in Brussels. Let's be careful. No mergers by foreign companies. Europe first. So it's not just US. You see it more or less everywhere.
Yeah. I think for Chris, it would be wonderful. I mean, you would never thought there was anything possible to get this whole Brexit business out of the focus of everybody. But now nobody talks about Brexit anymore.
It's about Brexit.
What are they focused on? I mean, you're living in Poland, but I mean, you're always in England. What is the focus in England? How are they basically positioning themselves between America and between Europe and their own problems?
I'll answer the question, Vincent. Before I do, it's quite funny because although I'm in Poland, thanks to the internet, it doesn't matter. I spend all day watching BBC News and keeping up with what's going on in the UK. And like this conversation, having Zoom calls with people around the world all day long. So global business continues even when you're locked in, as does local news from the UK. And the UK, it's just every day, it's non-stop. How many deaths, how many cases, the problems with the NHS, can it cope? Boris, will he survive? Won't he? Who cares? Whatever. And it kind of then leads to the press initially were complaining about the fact that we weren't locking down in Britain, and then they did lock down, and now they're complaining that we're not opening up. So the government can't win either way. They don't lock down soon enough, then they do, and then people say it's too much. Brexit is not in the news at all. It's not discussed at all. If you look for it, there is news about Brexit, and the bottom line is there's no way that Britain's leaving the European Union with trade deals this year, which is what the plan was. It's going to be at least another year, in my view, so at the end of 2021. And you have to think about, everyone's using this phrase, the new normal, which I don't really like very much. But we had that in the last financial crisis. We talked about a new normal in banking. Now it's a new normal for everybody. And the new normal is one where when this is finished, as I said earlier, there's questions about the survival of the European Union, the fact that nation states have closed borders across Europe and not followed European Union regulations or directives is quite a key issue, I think. That's going to take at least a year to get that sorted. So Brexit will be on the back burner for a long time.
And if I may add to that, because our latest company, Bankify, is founded both out of the Netherlands and the UK. So we have a very beautiful dual situation. But even today, if you look at the 20 people we employ, it's the United Nations of the world. And most of them work from the UK. They're still in the UK, and they come from Hungary. They come from absolutely everywhere. They come from Spain. And so literally, we spend probably 0.2% of our time talking about Brexit, and we spend the rest of the time worrying about, our team and getting our customers' life. So it really is a non-issue, and it's particularly a non-issue if you have a business that is formed digitally. We were formed and founded, and we work time, location, whatever, independent. And then you really see how totally insignificant the discussion is. But yesterday I was speaking to, people from a farming community, and then of course it is a big deal.
Let me talk a little bit about the role of government. At the very beginning, Arno talked about the amount of money pumped into the system by governments. Let's talk a little bit about both here in Holland and, for example, in the US, you have had these big discussions about privatizing parts of the economy. Well, nobody's talking about privatizing the other. It's the other way around. I mean, I've been following, as most of you know, US politics for quite a while. And Ronald Reagan wants to, follow in the footsteps of Ronald Reagan, who used to say, good government is a small government.
Yeah. Right
now, we see a situation where governments are, the place of last resort, by what they do and the amount of money they pump into the economy. Talk a little bit, if you will, about the role of government in the next phase of this whole crisis. Will it, get smaller again? Will it, like the Republicans want, like conservatives here in Europe want, or will it continue to be a very major power in international finance and economy? What do you think, Arnoud?
Now, the first tendency will always be that government will be bigger. Yeah, we always go through these phases where we make government smaller and then we make governments bigger. And this crisis will be used by many to point at the failure of the market economy, and therefore that governments should have a heavier role. And once you start thinking about where you could give a government a role, we can all come up with examples that make government interference in any sector possible. However, we know that economic growth, that prosperity, it does not come from governments. Governments have to provide the conditions, have to provide protection to people that fall between the cracks. Government plays an important role for what we call as economists common goods like education. Yeah. However, entrepreneurship, bottom-up initiatives are crucial. And that's also why in the European debate with a group of international economists, we try to direct the European Union away from these top-down massive investment projects that typically fail in this country, let alone at European scale, to bottom-up initiatives. Because the backbone of the European economy are corporations between 4 and 250 people. That's the backbone. And that we need to encourage.
Here's a question of our one of our lookers. He says, we're now having centralization in the whole financial system. That he's very interested in decentralization. We saw, of course, Bitcoin and cryptocurrencies. There was a way that small communities could have their own currency. I mean, we had the Industrial Revolution. It basically made England powerful. Then we had the Second World War, made America powerful. Is this crisis big enough to basically, it looks like it's only going to centralization. Will it also go to decentralization?
I had to think about Connie's answer about Africa, where the payment system is really this mobile phone linked payment system. So it's not the banks. They leapfrogged past all technology, and they came up with this what I call mobile phone based payment system, which is a very efficient payment system. So there are all kinds of initiatives that can come up from basically bottom up. And this mobile phone you can debate, but it is more or less bottom up. But keep in mind, where you have banks, even with the fintech revolution, which is massive and will change banking totally, where you have banks have enormous lobbying power. So governments are protecting banks. Central banks find banks crucial for their own monetary policy, who knows what. So banks are a little bit like state airlines. Why is Alitalia still alive? It's not because it's a good company. It is because of the Italian government. The same to some extent for KLM Air France. So do not underestimate the enormous power that large corporations have, and basically hold on to centralization in that way.
Do you agree, Connie?
Well, I agree, but I would have a counter question as well, because I do think that banks will change, the role will change in that for now, the big banks want to play a role in almost in stabilization and in, too big to fail type of organizations. And they want to be producers of goods that people really need. which is where it goes wrong, because they don't produce from the angle of what businesses or people need, but they produce from the fact what they have in their factory and what they've been pushing out for years. And they want to distribute it. And I think those three roles do not necessarily need to reside in one body anymore. And we always liked the idea it was in one body, because then we could just sort of regulate them and everything was regulated. But I think one of the things we now see, and I speak to a lot of VCs as well at the moment, you see that for instance, small businesses now need access to insights, they need fast money, they need to get paid faster. Well, they can get paid instantly, but credit card companies earn on not paying you instantly. So it's somewhere in the system, there's a false incentive. I'm not blaming all the credit card, that's not the idea, but very often we use the wrong tool to achieve a goal, and banks keep hanging on to their siloed organizations and to the payment products that have evolved over 50, 60, 80 years, and take that as a starting point for innovation. Whereas really, if you say, if people are going to be paid faster, let go of those payment types and do something else. And I think that, that is probably where we will need to see a lot of innovation. I cannot see that we will get our innovation fast enough if all the banks continue to do everything.
Okay, Chris, I mean, you've been preaching the gospel of the digital bank. Do you see is this crisis good enough to see a big acceleration, and what direction will it go into?
Well, I was quite lucky that I got a research project given to me in April, in the middle of the lockdown, to go and find out what people thought the future of money would be in Europe by interviewing 12 social media influencers who are in that space. And what's come out of that for me is a number of things. All of them say cash will still be around. It won't disappear, even though people think it's dirty and we shouldn't use it during this virus outbreak. People will still use cash because it's the one immediate anonymous form of value transfer that's trusted. But the big thing that came out from all of them is that central bank digital currencies are escalating rapidly, and things that were being discounted 3 months ago even are now being escalated to the top of the agenda of the central banks to say we have to get the economy moving on a digital platform basis. And apart from that, I've asked about things like Libra and Bitcoin. There's no great belief amongst these people in those currencies. They think it's going to be fiat-based digital currencies that will be ruling the roost in the next decade. Now, we can debate that point because everyone has a different belief. But what's intriguing for me is that when this crisis hit, obviously equities and stock markets took a big dip. So Bitcoin really was believed to be the future of money. Why did it take a dip? Because people don't have that confidence. If you had a digital dollar or a digital euro or a digital renminbi yuan, then I think you would see a very different attitude. And that's definitely going to happen within the next 12 to 36 months.
Yeah.
Maybe not the 12, maybe the only thing I may disagree on is the 12 months, but the technological possibilities. So it really define a new era. It's a little bit like the fixed line telephony. The fixed line telephone, we deregulated these telephone companies, and we thought that was a success. But it was not because of the deregulation of the fixed line, it was because the mobile telephone came up as a potentially superior alternative. And the central bank digital currency that Chris talked about, and also the comments of Connie, they refer to central banks are now forced by market developments to create an alternative cash instrument, an alternative cash currency, which is the central bank digital currency. And that creates the breakup that Connie was advocating, because that more or less means that we hold directly money with the central bank, all of us, and the role of commercial banks will become much more cleaner. They will have a less essential role in the system. So the combination of Connie and Chris, I think, will leapfrog us to the next system. It will not be 12 months, though.
Yeah, and as you showed the Bitcoin price, the only reason why it's coming back is because the halving is coming, and the halving always throws a bounce in the value of Bitcoin.
Yeah. Well, I've always, I'm of course very interested in this decentralized way to basically to organize and control money, and Bitcoin is now the best example. We were wondering, is it going to be more able to deal with the crisis than gold or something like that. But so far, it's going up and down just as much as the stock market. So
it is, and you mustn't forget, it really is and you're going to kill me, but it is a toy for the people in the game. It is not for normal people who just go about their business and they plum stuff during the day and then they come home and feed their kids and send them to university. And so, and I'm not saying that therefore it's not relevant. It's very relevant, but it is a playpen for those in the know and the rich and the people who can afford to lose money.
And more important than that, Connie, is that it's going through iterations. So where Bitcoin started is not where it's going to finish. And Bitcoin's 6.3 or whatever it is, it may be called something completely different, but there will be a digital currency that might be a people's currency, alongside the central bank digital currencies.
And also, we know that when there's a real big crisis, and we saw it now, people run to what it feels safe. So they run to mummy, to the bank, and to the government. We're suddenly a hell of a lot less innovative if it really hits our own wallet. Yeah. And that's why, the central banks, whether we like it or not, they will remain to be involved.
Yeah. I have a question about innovation. In Dutch, we have the expression, onder druk wordt alles vloeibaar. In English, under pressure, everything becomes fluid. Can you talk a little bit about innovation in the banking sector or more in general in technology? Crises never stop innovation. On the contrary, quite often it accelerated quite often innovation and new business models. Will the same happen during and after this Corona crisis? Can I start with you, Chris? What do you think? Innovation and Corona, is that a good combination?
Well, we saw a huge amount of innovation after the last financial crisis in 2008. It actually spawned the fintech industry. And we're going to see the same after this pandemic. What's been interesting from my side is already I've seen a lot of the issue into by way of example, Starling Bank in the UK, a challenger bank, created a companion card that anybody can give to a carer or member of the family to go and do their shopping for them. The card they can pop up on demand. Equally, I saw another fintech startup in
Chris, I have to stop you. I mean, you talked about 5G, but at least on my side, the connection is pretty poor.
Yeah.
Am I the only one?
No, it's really true. Yeah.
Yeah. Your 5G is maybe, I don't know, because you're breaking up. Can you turn off some applications, or I'm not sure. Vincent, you're an expert in these kind of issues.
I mean, from my side, I've got a strange call that came on when Vincent came back, so I don't know whether it's me or Vincent.
Okay, I'll go away.
Yeah.
Maybe it's better now.
Yeah, I'll pitch in and see whether yours stabilizes, Chris. You can take over again. We always do this anyway. I think that if you look because obviously I work, with people at Holland FinTech and Arches and all those and you see a lot of scared young entrepreneurs now, and don't be fooled, at Bankify as well. We're not scared at all. For us, it's a massive opportunity because it really validated what we're doing. But it is for every entrepreneur. This is really challenging. There's no salary coming in the bank, so you've got to just live on what you had or innovate or get more money in. But I think if you immediately look at the real struggle with everything around innovation and the whole Corona thing, was the fact that a lot of banks were playing games with innovation in a fancy fintech innovation hub, putting what Chris and I call lipstick on a pig. And so happy appies and fun stuff, and everybody was excited. And really, I've been saying this for years, and I've written about it. The real heroes in the bank are really the people in the middle and the back office. The guys who make the whole bank operational and secure 24/7. And I think that anything that speeds up that process is now hot ground for VCs, but also I think for innovation. So anything around speeding up digital identity, digital signatures. If you have a digital signature, you get your loan 3 days to a week sooner. If you have your KYC process, if you outsource it to a manual lab in India with 13,000 people, that's not going to speed up your bank. If you have a full, in your belly, you have a straight through process around all of those core elements, then you can do really, really well as a bank. So I think investments in that will really fare well. Anything around the SME customer, banks have forced business people to choose either for a business account, which is overcharged, way too much stuff, small businesses, or they put them in retail and then they're almost doing illegal stuff. So I think that whole segment will be embraced. Anything you do for that segment, bring bookkeeping and banking together in the banking channel, is a success. But also anything customer support automation. So I see fantastic opportunities in this industry, and think of everywhere where we now see, if you don't need a branch, but you might cut out the middleman. Wealth management, the traditional systems will be under pressure because assets under management are going down, and that's normally how they price this stuff. But if you have a very lean and agile model, it works better. Mortgages, life insurances, there's still a lot to do, but I think it will be less sexy and more core.
Back to you, Chris. I think you guys were right. I think Vincent was the bad guy here when it came to connection. He set this up. But talking about innovation, Chris, I mean, if you look back to the last, 12, 13, 14 years, back to the last banking crisis, I mean, we've seen a tremendous growth of the frightful five: Amazon, Apple, Facebook, Google. We've seen new business models. We've seen 3D printing, smart data, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, everything. I mean, it's exploding. So we've seen this innovation, accelerate instead of slowing down. And same question for you, also a little broader than just fintech. What kind of futures do you see for innovation in the next couple of years after Corona is done?
Well, I think if you look at the broad macro view, then obviously the biggest areas that are going to take a hit is anything to do with conferences, media, tourism, travel, airline, hospitality. And all of those industries are going to have to change dramatically in the very near term. And their changes will actually result in huge changes in the long term. Whilst I've been locked down, I've been looking at concerts and things that I used to enjoy doing, and I'm thinking, well, there's no social distancing when you have 60,000 people in a stadium watching Elton John or the Killers on stage. How is that going to look in 5 years, 10 years? And I think it really means that crisis creates rapid cycle innovations, and the rapid cycle innovation we've seen here, it was immediately nearly everyone switched to doing what we're doing, using video. And not just using video in business, but using video to talk to family. I'm talking to my mum 3 times a week on a video call, whereas I used to talk to her once a week on a phone call. And that's just because of this crisis that's happened. And because we've switched to that, I'm fairly sure we'll stay with that forever, because it gives her the chance to see not just me, but the whole family here and feel like we're being much more social. And so social has been fueled to move digitally far quicker in the last few months than it ever has before. But the same with trade, as I said earlier on, the offline to online supply chain structure has been rapidly reinvented in the last couple of months. And that will also have a big impact long term. Global supply chains are really questionable when you have the potential to have something coming across on a container ship that's undesirable. So people are rethinking everything. And particularly for me, having just written a book about doing digital transformation that just came out in April, in some ways it's good news, because I actually think, for all the companies that are trying to do digital transformation and had it on the back burner or third on their priority list, that's now going to be number one. And the innovation that comes out of that with AI, distributed ledger technology, apps, APIs, open banking, open platforms is going to be incredible.
Yeah.
What about you, Arnold? Innovation and new business models, because that's the name of the game. Finding new business models based on technology and new way of thinking, like Chris was just describing. I mean, we have business models that are totally, part of our day-to-day lives now that were unthinkable 10 or even sometimes 5 years ago. What about new business models, new sources of income and creativity? What kind of stuff do you see coming?
But Charles, you already saw from the answer of Chris that most of these business models already existed, but it was human behavior. We had to get used to it. For example,
They're making them smarter.
Yeah, this whole example of video conferences, which we always considered second best. And now we are more or less forced to do it. And now we realize, gee, basically it has enormous benefits. We have more time to do real stuff instead of all this traveling. And we are wasting our time.
Vincent's kids have to stop watching Netflix so he can join us again, I guess, right? I mean, because probably his kids are all watching Netflix and taking up the broadband and ruining our signal.
and imposing externalities on your guests. So that's really the bad thing. Yeah.
Welcome back, Vincent.
Sorry, Chris. Yeah, no, I thought I'd give Chris a little bit of 5G space because obviously from Amsterdam, I'm influencing him there in Warsaw.
You don't have that there.
I like to be the bad guy.
So the human behavior, what we are used to, that ultimately drives the adoption of innovations. And because the last 20 years, we have developed all these concepts that can be used. And Connie is totally right that most of the things that have to do with fintech are consumer-oriented, while banks were always product-oriented, selling stuff that was on the shelf. And the big benefit of fintech, the big benefit of all types of platforms is that they are consumer-oriented. So they adopt services and they come with new combinations. And I think Chris was talking about what way you can combine a financial product with another type of product that serves a particular purpose of the consumer. And that type of attitude is very difficult for an existing bank to replicate. Its technology is not like that. Its back office is truly in back office, while for fintech, the back office is data that can be used in the front office. So it's a very different mindset and way of organizing businesses. So I think it will accelerate enormously due to this crisis.
Yeah. I have a fundamental question to you all, because yesterday I struggled with it when we did the B&R podcast. Why is it that we always start with what we have already and that we're incapable of letting that go and think like, what do we want to create with innovation? It's like, Chris and I, we go into a bank, you speak to people and they say, but what you're doing, that is new indeed. You're combining bookkeeping and payments and cash management for SME. Well, then you need to speak to somebody in cash, somebody in trade, somebody in the SME segment, or somebody in payments. They love what you do, but they drag you back into their silos. We talked with the Farmers Union yesterday at B&R, and we said, but if we all agree that we so love the much clearer air and that we need to just change the whole way we eat and consume, why not look at that and then work back?
Do you remember the famous presentation Steve Jobs gave when he introduced the iPhone? And he basically said, folks, this is nothing new. It's just 3 pieces of equipment combined in one: a browser, a camera, and a phone. And that's it. And it was the iPhone at the beginning of the smartphone era. So here we are with your 3 silos, bringing them together, creates a lot of value and incredible business models. I mean, try to come up with an estimate of the number of business models based on this piece of equipment, which was based on old technology. The browser was already there. We had cameras and we had phones. And you put in one piece of equipment.
But I'm really interested still. I mean, the top thing, these big, huge central banks, which throw in unbelievable amount of money and really, terabytes, I want to say, but unbelievable amount of money. 100% of the gross national product is thrown in it. And on the other side, we try on the lowest side to do all kinds of new innovations, new business models. That seems to be an incredible problem to have these two basically hit each other. The big amount of money, the big debt, which is basically thrown all over it, and the unbelievable amount of power governments have. And on the other hand, we want decentralized systems. We want to be more in charge of it. And we don't want to be dependent on the big fights between China and America and Africa. Will the decentralized money system come to fruition thanks to this crisis, or will it be more centralization? What do you think, Arnoud?
It's a difficult question, because if you ask the next 5 years, Obviously, it's not going to come to decentralization in terms of money in the next 5 years. These things will automatically take time, but we see developments in your direction. We have learned in the last 25, 30 years. We have learned that the financial economy was overtaking the real economy, which is kind of strange because wealth ultimately resides in the real economy. The financial economy is a layer on top of it. It's a layer on top. So the question is, why is the layer on top of it? Why did it get alive on its own? It should have been linked to the real economy. And that's precisely what you're pointing at. And this is my struggle so far with a lot of technology in the past, where we use technology to say things can be bigger. Because due to information technology, you can serve 10 million people instead of 1 million. But information technology also allows you to organize things on a local scale efficiently. So that information technology also allows localization. And that type of development we have not seen on a massive scale yet. And that is going to be the answer to your question.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I promised you at 4 o'clock we would basically leave. I think we discussed every aspect of the big financial system and the fintech technology and the old and the new and the. No, we didn't. We just started to basically touch it. But I thought it was a really great conversation. I want to thank Arnoud.
Can I do one quick final question, Vincent, to all three of you?
Of course.
I mean, we've been talking briefly about the new normal, and somebody said, well, I don't like the new normal, which is fine. But make a prediction. We are going into a new normal in a lot of ways. Will it, and I start with you, Chris, in Warsaw, will the new normal eventually be a better normal?
I think so. I mean, I think it's interesting that one of the key things I've learned during the last 2 months is we've had many pandemics in the past. And most people say the last one was the 1918 Spanish flu, but there's actually been 2 other major ones after that. And equally, there's been SARS and Ebola and lots of other incidents. And I think the post-pandemic world is going to be one where it's a lot more digital, a lot more social on digital, a lot more connectivity visually like we're having here. But specifically, I think it'll be a much safer world. I think we're going to actually address a lot of issues. And before you know it, we'll probably have forgotten completely about 2020's pandemic.
Yeah. Well, I hope for once Churchill, my old friend, is wrong and that we are capable of learning from past mistakes. And I do think that if you really look at the world through a clear lens, through the zeitgeist, and not through our privileged Western position, I think it is inevitable that the next generation will force us to build a world with less waste, more accessible, also more equal. And I don't mean that in a political way. It's for economies. It's a very good idea. And just a world with a slightly better pace of life for everybody. I really think, and particularly less waste. That is very high on my agenda.
Arnoud?
Yeah, Charles, let my answer be short. I'm always optimistic, and I think there's reason to be optimistic. We have shocked the system. We have shocked the system. All kinds of forces were already there, like what Connie was referring to, environmental concerns. We were hitting barriers. We are forced to accelerate, to act on those. I'm optimistic.
And you know what? Part of the new normal is this weekly podcast.
Oh, wow.
And we'll be back next week, right, Vincent?
We'll be back next week. And it was really, and Charles wrote a book about being the ultimate optimist, and he is. He basically always sees the good in things. I also loved it. But I think the 1 hour we had here together, all over the world together, was already a nice optimistic thing to discuss it. I have confidence that the system will not collapse and will innovate from the ground up. And I want to thank you very much for coming here. And also the people who basically listened to us basically said, good discussion, thanks. They really appreciate it. And I also appreciate that you watched and you looked. Thanks, Arnoud, Chris, and Connie, and Charles.
Thank you very much.
Great green screen.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Stay safe.
Okay.